You do not belong near this casket. Old man. The words left Officer Thomas Riley's mouth with the cold certainty of someone who had delivered similar insults many times before, never imagining that this moment would become the line that shattered his career, his reputation, and the last remaining illusion that his badge could shield him from consequence. He stepped toward the man he believed was an imposter, unaware that he was walking directly into the mistake that would unravel a decade of buried complaints. His arm rose without hesitation. The blast of pepper spray struck the retired general across the face, burning his eyes, stealing his breath, and driving knives of pain through a man who had survived Afghanistan without ever lowering his dignity. The humiliation was immediate, sharp, and witnessed by every soul standing beside the flag-draped casket of Colonel David Lawson. And as the general staggered but refused to fall, the officer shouted again, voice cracking beneath a fury he could not justify. One single question hovered over the scene like a verdict waiting to be read. If you saw that moment of cruelty explode back on the man who caused it, would you call it instant karma or long-delayed truth? Before going into this story, tell me, where are you watching from today? Take a moment to subscribe to the channel and give me a like, because your support helps these powerful stories reach more people who care about justice and accountability. Elijah Marcus Thompson rode toward the Virginia State Military Cemetery that morning with a silence shaped by memory, duty, and a grief that pressed against the edges of his breath. At 65, he had learned to live with the burdens of war, the weight of lost soldiers, and the years of small indignities that followed him long after he hung his uniform in the back of his closet. Yet today he chose to wear that uniform again. The dress blues carried every battle he had survived, every man he had led, and every friend he had buried. And now they carried the final tribute to Colonel David Isaiah Lawson, the last battlefield brother who remained from the firestorm in Helmand Province. Lawson had dragged him from a burning Humvee, kept his heart beating with his bare hands, and stood beside him in every chapter of their long service. There were no medals that could capture a bond like that. Elijah knew only one way to honor him. He would stand straight, he would salute, and he would do it in the uniform that told the world who they had been together. His granddaughter Sophia sat beside him, watching him with the worried tenderness that only youth could hold. She had argued with him gently that morning, trying to convince him to wear a civilian suit. "Granddad, people treat you differently when you wear this. You know they do. Please." Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from the exhaustion of watching him endure what others refused to see. He answered her with a calm that came from years of steady command. "Today I wear the uniform so my friend gets the salute he earned." He did not raise his voice. He did not try to persuade. He simply stated a truth that stood taller than the years that separated them. Sophia understood, even if it pained her. She knew her grandfather had carried both pride and sorrow in silence for a lifetime. She also knew that the world still judged a black man in uniform long before it read the stars on his shoulders. Miles away, Officer Thomas Riley prepared for his assignment at the cemetery. He had 10 years on the Windsor Police Department and 12 formal complaints of racial bias, each one filed by a citizen who remembered his face and his voice long after the report was buried. Riley walked into each shift believing that threats wore certain colors, spoke with certain accents, or stood in certain neighborhoods. Those beliefs had shaped the way he acted and the way he justified the things he did. His commanders had dismissed the complaints again and again, calling them insufficient evidence, while Riley convinced himself they proved he was the only one with clear judgment. His resentment grew quietly, fed by every shift that ended without praise, every rumor that he was difficult, and every reminder that other officers were climbing faster than he was. This morning he carried all of that inside him. The cemetery assignment felt beneath him. He believed real danger lived elsewhere. The funeral assembled slowly beneath a sky that did not yet know it would become the backdrop of a national reckoning. Sarah Lawson, widow of Colonel David Lawson, stood near the casket with a stillness born from decades of loving a soldier. Soldiers from every generation formed a quiet line. Local officers took posts at the perimeter. Sophia set her phone to silent and placed it in her pocket, thinking only about honoring the man who had been like an uncle to her. When Elijah stepped from the car in full dress uniform, every gathered veteran recognized the shoulders, the bearing, and the history that walked with him. He moved toward the casket with the solemn purpose of a man who had long ago learned the cost of life and the meaning of death. Riley noticed him from across the grass. He squinted at the two-star insignia, then at the skin beneath it, and a conclusion formed in his mind before thought had a chance to intervene. His hand moved to his body camera. His pulse tightened. He convinced himself, again, that intuition was the same thing as truth. He approached with a stride that broke the silence of the ceremony. But for Elijah, none of that mattered yet. He positioned himself beside the flag-draped casket, raised his hand, and delivered a salute so precise and so steady that even the young soldiers watching felt the weight of its meaning. In that instant, two very different worlds collided. One world, shaped by service, sacrifice, and quiet dignity. The other, shaped by suspicion, unchecked power, and a decade of overlooked warnings. Elijah Marcus Thompson held his salute with the quiet strength of a man who had stood unshaken in war zones where the air burned with dust and danger. But nothing prepared him for the moment. Officer Thomas Riley stormed across the cemetery lawn with a voice that sliced through the funeral silence. Riley barked, "Drop your hand right now, or I will put you on the ground." A command so jarring that mourners froze mid-breath, stunned that anyone would speak to a grieving soldier in such a tone, much less a man in full-dress uniform. But Riley's belief was fixed. He saw only a black man in stars he decided could not be real. He reached for his pepper spray with the certainty of someone who had misread situations before and always walked away untouched. The moment the spray hit Elijah's face, fire tore across the general's eyes and skin, a searing burn that stole his vision, clouded his breath, and forced him to fight for balance while standing beside the casket of the man who had saved his life decades earlier. The sting felt like betrayal. The humiliation cut deeper than the pain. Yet in the midst of it, Elijah's posture never collapsed. He lowered his salute slowly, then steadied himself as the wind carried the officer's shouted order. "Get on the ground now!" Through a crowd that had come expecting honor, not brutality. Sophia, shaking but resolute, lifted her phone and began recording, driven by instinct, fear, and the knowledge that no one would believe this unless the world saw it with their own eyes. Funeral staff rushed forward in shock, but Riley spun toward them with a hand on his gun, barking at them to stay back. Panic rippled through the mourners. Sarah Lawson gasped, her hand covering her mouth as she watched her husband's closest friend blinded and stumbling near the folded flag placed carefully above the casket. Soldiers who recognized the stars on Elijah's shoulders moved instinctively, but their training held them in place. They knew that stepping forward could escalate the danger, and they could not risk a chaotic scene unfolding around a sacred farewell. Riley pointed his weapon at Elijah's chest, shouting the same rehearsed command he had used too many times on people who posed no threat at all. "On your knees," he repeated, voice shaking not with fear, but with the rush of authority he believed was absolute. Elijah did not drop to his knees. He raised his chin through the burning pain and spoke through labored breaths. "Officer, I am Major General Elijah Thompson. I came to salute my brother." His voice carried no anger, only exhaustion, only truth. It was the kind of truth that should have stopped everything. But Riley's judgment had long been shaped by assumptions he mistook for experience. He heard the words. He refused to believe them. Sophia stepped closer, tears streaking down her face, her voice tight as she called out, "He is my grandfather. He served 37 years. He is a general. Please stop." But Riley turned his weapon toward her, shouting for her to back away. The threat struck the crowd like a shockwave. Mourners shouted for him to stop. Veterans raised their hands in disbelief. Even officers stationed at the perimeter hesitated, unsure whether to intervene or obey the man whose orders seemed increasingly unhinged. One of them placed a hand on his radio, whispering urgently for supervision. Another took a step forward before freezing. Torn between duty and fear of departmental punishment, Elijah's eyes burned so fiercely he could barely distinguish shapes. Yet he stood his ground. He refused to fall, refused to kneel, refused to let the moment steal the dignity he had carried through battlefields no one could imagine. Every second stretched painfully, each breath a mix of agony and memory. He thought of Lawson pulling him from the flames in Helmand, whispering, "Don't you die on me." Eli. He remembered the years of denied disability claims, the moments when officials glanced at his skin before reading his record. He thought of his granddaughter watching, recording, trembling, and he thought of the countless veterans whose stories never reached a camera. That thought steadied him more than any order or law. From behind him, Sarah Lawson's voice cracked as she shouted, "Stop this! Please stop this man!" But Riley ignored her. He lunged, grabbing Elijah's arm, twisting it behind him with a force that drew a faint gasp from the general but no resistance. Elijah had survived shrapnel, gunfire, and nights spent wondering whether dawn would ever come. He knew how to endure pain, but this was different. This was a violation in a place built for honor, a wound delivered not by an enemy, but by the very officer assigned to protect the funeral. Sophia kept filming, even when Riley screamed at her to put the phone down. She steadied her hand as best she could, her heart pounding so hard her vision blurred. She captured every second as her grandfather struggled to breathe through the burn, as the mourners stepped back in fear, as Riley's weapon wavered with the reckless tremor of a man who believed he was still in control. But control had already slipped away. Not one person in that cemetery realized that the footage being recorded at that very moment would soon tear through social media, ignite national outrage, and drag 10 years of buried misconduct into daylight. Riley shoved Elijah against the casket stand, causing the flag to shift slightly. Gasps echoed across the cemetery. Veterans reached toward the flag with reflexive reverence, their hearts breaking at the sight of the disrespect. Elijah steadied himself with one hand, refusing to collapse. The burn in his eyes had become unbearable. Each blink felt like rubbing sand into an open wound. Yet he spoke again with calm clarity. "You are making a mistake," he said, his voice trembling not from fear but from stunned sorrow. "This is a military funeral. I have harmed no one." Riley answered with a hard shove and a second threat of arrest, his voice louder, harsher, more unstable with every word. But the power dynamic had already begun to shift. Mourners no longer looked at him with confusion. They looked at him with horror. Officers at the edge no longer hesitated because they feared punishment. They hesitated because they could see the line he had crossed. Sophia zoomed in, capturing the weapon pointed at a man who had once commanded thousands. She whispered to herself, "Please, someone help him." But she did not stop recording. She knew she couldn't. The camera had become the only defense, the only witness, the only barrier between her grandfather and something unthinkable. The moment stretched into a silence thick with dread. The funeral details stared in disbelief. The folded flag trembled in a faint breeze, and Elijah blinked through tears of pain as he raised his head just enough to face the man who had assaulted him. "I came to honor my brother," he said softly, That is all. Those words would later echo across millions of screens. Spoken by a man who had every reason to shout but chose dignity instead. And they would become the line that defined the case, the reform, and the story that forced a country to look at itself. By dawn the next morning, the footage of Officer Thomas Riley pepper spraying and threatening a decorated black general at a military funeral had already escaped the confines of the cemetery and surged across the country with the force of a breaking dam. Sophia's trembling hands had filmed every second, and when she whispered through tears, "People need to see this," she released more than a video. She released a reckoning. The clip opened with Riley shouting, "Drop your hand right now, or I will put you on the ground," followed by the burst of pepper spray striking Elijah Thompson mid-salute. The world watched a two-star general choke, stagger, and cling to dignity as a white officer aimed a weapon at his chest. Then the angle shifted as Sophia cried out, "He is my grandfather." While Riley swung his gun toward her, viewers heard Elijah's voice through the agony, steady and unmistakable. "I am Major General Elijah Thompson. I came to salute my brother." It was that line, delivered through pain and humiliation, that struck the nation with more force than any weapon on Riley's belt. Veterans froze mid-scroll. Active duty soldiers stopped in hallways. Gold Star families wept. Civil rights advocates stepped forward. Newsrooms lit up. The video passed 10 million views by mid-morning, 30 million before noon, 50 million before the day ended. Hashtags rose instantly. Hashtag Virginia Salute. Hashtag Veteran While Black. Hashtag Protect Our Veterans. And for once, the outrage crossed every political line. What people felt was not ideological. It was human. It was visceral. And it was undeniable. Networks replayed the footage with stunned anchors struggling to speak through their own disbelief. Retired generals called in with voices trembling between anger and sorrow. One said, "I served 35 years, and I have never seen a soldier treated with such contempt on American soil." Another whispered, "He held a salute through pain most men cannot bear." Black veterans, long accustomed to quiet forms of disrespect, flooded social platforms with their own stories. Some posted pictures of medals they had earned, alongside memories of being mistaken for security guards, mechanics, or not the real service member. Others wrote of Veterans Affairs claims denied without explanation, of burial honors withheld, of uniforms questioned simply because of the men wearing them. Their testimonials created a chorus the nation had never fully heard before. And for the first time in a long time, it listened. Sophia's name trended as well, not because she sought attention, but because people recognized that her courage had prevented a tragedy. Commenters wrote, "Her recording saved his life, and, without that video, no one would have believed this." Veterans' spouses wrote in gratitude. Law students praised her calm under terror. Strangers reached out to thank her for giving the country the truth. She watched the reactions in stunned silence. Torn between pride and heartbreak, she had wanted to honor Colonel Lawson. Instead, she had documented an assault on her grandfather at the Windsor Police Department headquarters. Panic crackled through the hallways. Supervisors gathered in tense clusters, whispering about the 12 prior complaints against Riley that now looked like warnings no one had heeded. Captain Marcus Delgado, the commander who had signed off on every insufficient evidence ruling, avoided reporters at the entrance. Officers who once worked alongside Riley found their own body cam footage pulled for review. Some defended him, others quietly distanced themselves, afraid the coming investigation would expose much more than one incident. The governor of Virginia held a somber press conference by early afternoon. His voice was steady but carried a weight that had not been present the day before. No veteran, especially not a decorated general attending the funeral of a fallen brother, should ever experience what Major General Thompson endured. He called for an independent investigation. He called the footage disturbing, unacceptable, and incompatible with Virginia's values. But even as he spoke, he understood the truth. The outrage had already moved beyond statements. The country wanted action. Civil rights attorneys stepped forward within hours. Some contacted Sophia directly, offering assistance. Others announced nationwide petitions demanding criminal charges. Military advocacy groups issued joint statements, saying the footage represented a betrayal of every veteran who has ever worn the uniform. Even the Department of Defense released a brief but pointed acknowledgement that it was monitoring the situation closely. Riley's first response came through a local television interview, arranged by his union representative. His face appeared tense, his voice tight. He claimed he had acted on officer instinct, insisting that he perceived a threat. But as the unedited footage rolled beside his interview, viewers saw a calm elderly man standing in solemn respect beside a casket. They saw a granddaughter pleading for mercy. They saw a weapon raised without justification. Riley's words fell apart in real time. The anchor's expression shifted from politeness to disbelief. Social media erupted again, hashtags calling for his termination, arrest, and decertification surged. His interview became a second scandal layered on top of the first. Meanwhile, Elijah remained silent, not because he lacked words, but because his life had taught him that silence carried its own power. He stayed home, eyes still red from the pepper spray, memories rising uninvited. Sophia sat beside him, scrolling through messages from strangers offering prayers, support, and apologies on behalf of a country that had failed him more times than it admitted. Sarah Lawson called to say she had seen the video and could not stop crying, not just for her husband's death, but for the desecration of the dignity that should have defined his final ceremony. Elijah listened quietly, then answered with the calm steadiness people had always known. "This is not about me," he said. "This is about truth." As the story unfolded, veterans organizations announced emergency meetings. Civil rights leaders scheduled rallies near the cemetery gates. Members of Congress began drafting letters demanding federal review of the Windsor Police Department. Commentators debated deeper questions. Why were black veterans more likely to have disability claims denied? Why did burial honors differ depending on race? Why did misconduct complaints disappear inside certain departments? Why did a general need a camera to prove he had done nothing wrong? The pressure grew until the Windsor Police Department had no choice. Late in the evening, they issued a terse public statement. Officer Thomas Riley has been placed on administrative leave pending investigation, but the public saw through it instantly. Millions commented. "Administrative leave is not accountability," others wrote. "A man who survived Helmand deserved better than this." The country had taken a side, and it was not the department's. Even as the night deepened, the video continued to climb in views, each share carrying anger, grief, and something else. Resolve. Communities across the nation found themselves united by a single truth they could no longer ignore. The footage was more than evidence. It was a mirror held up to a country still wrestling with its promises. Elijah did not celebrate the public response. He did not rage about what had happened. He only sat quietly, eyes lowered, remembering the friend he had come to honor and the ceremony that had been shattered. When Sophia asked softly, "Granddad, are you all right?" He placed a hand over hers and said, "I have seen storms like this before, but this time, the country is the one holding the camera." The investigation that followed unfolded with the quiet inevitability of a storm that had long been gathering over Windsor. Even before Officer Thomas Riley pepper-sprayed a general beside a flag-draped casket, the viral footage did not merely expose one violent act, it forced open a vault that the department had spent a decade sealing shut. Internal Affairs began by reviewing Riley's file, and what they found sent a tremor through the building. 12 prior complaints, 12 opportunities to intervene, 12 warnings ignored, minimized, or dismissed with the same phrase stamped in black ink: insufficient evidence. Most of the complainants were black men and women who had described unwarranted stops, searches without cause, intimidation, and racial slurs whispered when cameras were conveniently off. Riley had denied everything each time, and Captain Marcus Delgado had signed off on every dismissal. But now those dusty reports were no longer silent. Each one became a voice in a growing chorus demanding answers. And for the first time, the department had no place to hide. The review grew wider with every passing hour. Supervisors realized the pattern stretched far beyond Riley alone. It led through command decisions, flawed review procedures, and a culture that had quietly encouraged officers to trust instinct over evidence, suspicion over training, authority over restraint. Lieutenant Vanessa Brooks, the department's highest-ranking black woman, stepped forward, trembling but resolute. She had filed 3 internal reports on Riley over the years: complaints about inappropriate language, reports of him escalating routine stops, notes on him targeting drivers based on appearance rather than behavior. Each time she raised concern. The room fell silent. The air grew uncomfortable, and the subject changed. She stood before the Internal Affairs panel and said, "I reported him repeatedly, but command always ruled insufficient evidence. The evidence was his pattern, but no one wanted to see it." Her testimony cracked open a truth the department had concealed behind stained paperwork and careful silence. The investigation spread to other parts of the county government, and soon the Regional Veterans Affairs Office found itself pulled into the spotlight. Advocates noticed something unsettling when they examined Elijah's case history. His long-denied post-traumatic stress disorder claim had been rejected despite clear documentation, consistent medical evaluations, and strong evidence of combat trauma. That discovery led attorneys to dig deeper, and what they uncovered was a pattern far larger than one general's file. Black veterans in the region had disproportionately high rates of denied post-traumatic stress disorder claims, denied burial honors, and delayed appeals. Families had complained, letters had been written, but each concern had been routed to the same bureaucratic loop that drained urgency from every plea. The viral video changed that. It forced the Veterans Affairs to open its records to federal review, and for the first time, officials had to admit that the denial patterns were not random. They revealed systemic disparity layered into decisions made quietly over decades. While the head of the Regional Veterans Affairs Office insisted the disparities were unintentional, the numbers told a different story, one that could not be softened by polite explanations. Sophia watched these revelations unfold with a mixture of anger and determination. She understood, more clearly each day, that what had happened at the cemetery was not an isolated moment. It was the eruption of buried failures, ignored warnings, and cultural rot that stretched through institutions meant to protect and honor veterans like her grandfather. She met with civil rights attorneys who explained that the video gave them a rare opportunity, a case so clear, so irrefutable, that it could force national attention and uncover deeper injustice. They urged her to consider litigation that went beyond criminal charges against Riley. They wanted structural change. They wanted accountability that could not be quietly reversed once the public lost interest. Sophia listened, her heart heavy, and finally agreed. Together with a team of pro bono lawyers, she filed federal civil rights lawsuits against both Officer Riley and the Windsor Police Department. The filing cited not only the assault at the funeral but also the pattern of ignored complaints, the department's failure to discipline, and the systemic neglect within the broader institution. As investigators continued their work, more officers stepped forward quietly. Some shared concerns they had been too afraid to report. Others admitted they had noticed Riley's behavior but believed nothing would change if they spoke up. A few confessed they feared backlash, demotion, or ridicule if they challenged a colleague considered overly aggressive but loyal. The truth that emerged was not about one man. It was about a system built on unwritten rules. Protect your own, avoid controversy, label patterns as coincidences, and hope no one looked too closely. That system was now collapsing under the weight of undeniable evidence. Captain Delgado, once confident in his decisions, found himself cornered by facts he could no longer explain. Reporters confronted him with pointed questions, asking why 12 complaints vanished into his signature. His answers shifted by the day. At one point, he claimed the cases lacked corroboration. Another day, he insisted the complainants were inconsistent. But when shown the files side by side, the patterns were unmistakable. Delgado's excuses dissolved, leaving only the truth he thought would remain buried. His decisions had protected an officer who should have been removed years ago. His denials became part of the public record, and the public had already decided they would not accept them. As weeks passed, hearings convened across the state. Veteran advocacy groups demanded reforms to the burial process. Civil rights leaders insisted on changes to police oversight. Members of Congress announced inquiries into racial disparities in Veterans Affairs decisions. And through it all, Elijah remained quiet. He did not attend press conferences. He did not speak to reporters. He did not offer commentary about the wave of outrage sweeping the nation. Instead, he sat with Sophia, watching hearings on television, hearing officials struggle to explain decisions they had once made without hesitation. One evening, as the sun set outside his living room window, Sophia asked him softly, "Do you think any of this would have surfaced if I had not recorded it?" Elijah looked at her with the solemn patience of a man who had lived long enough to understand the way truth often needed to be dragged into daylight. "Yes," he said, because the truth was already there. The camera simply forced them to see it. As the investigations deepened, the nation began to understand the full measure of what had been hidden. The cemetery incident had been the spark, but the fire had been burning for years. And now, with the world watching, every buried truth stepped forward, one file at a time, demanding reckoning. The federal courtroom in Richmond carried a stillness that felt heavier than any silence that had filled the Virginia cemetery weeks earlier. When the doors opened for the first day of testimony, the gallery filled instantly. Veterans in uniform, widows carrying folded flags, students holding notebooks, reporters adjusting microphones, and ordinary citizens who had watched the viral video and could not shake the image of a general blinded beside his brother's casket. The air carried reverence for Elijah Thompson and an unspoken expectation that truth, long delayed, would finally be named aloud. Officer Thomas Riley entered with shoulders hunched. His once imposing posture collapsed into the wary gait of a man who understood, perhaps for the first time, that the authority he had misused for a decade could not protect him here. He wore a suit that did nothing to soften the lines of fear etched across his face. His union representative sat beside him, offering forced reassurance. But even that could not drown out the murmurs that rippled through the gallery. Murmurs from people who had come not out of curiosity, but out of a sense of moral witness. They had seen the footage. They knew what was coming. And so did he. The prosecution opened with the video itself, played on a large screen that cast its light across every face in the courtroom. The footage began with Riley shouting, "Drop your hand right now or I will put you on the ground." And the room reacted the way millions had reacted online, with a mix of disbelief, anger, and heartbreak. The spray burst across Elijah's face in real time, and even though the courtroom was silent, the sharp sound of the attack echoed with new force. Then came the moment Riley pointed his weapon at Sophia. Gasps erupted in the gallery, reporters scribbled furiously, veterans shook their heads in grief, and the judge, Margaret Ellison, paused the video herself when Sophia's muffled cry played through the speakers. The pause hung in the room for several long seconds, as if giving everyone present a moment to reckon with the cruelty shown on screen, when she finally said, "Continue." Her voice carried the weight of the office she held and the compassion of someone who understood the damage one action could inflict on generations. Witness after witness stepped forward. Funeral attendees described the fear, the confusion, and the heartbreak of watching a solemn ceremony devolve into violence. Veterans testified about the precision of Elijah's salute, explaining that only someone deeply trained could maintain posture through that level of pain. Several officers from the perimeter detail admitted they had hesitated to intervene, not because they believed Riley was right, but because they feared departmental retaliation, a truth that underscored the cultural rot the trial sought to expose. And then came Lieutenant Vanessa Brooks, who walked to the stand with the quiet resolve of someone who had carried truth alone for too long. She detailed her history with Riley, the racial slurs she overheard, the reports she submitted, the times she warned command that his conduct would lead to tragedy. "If the department had acted on any one of my reports," she said softly, "that general would have saluted his friend without harm." Her words pierced through the courtroom with devastating clarity. When Riley took the stand, his testimony unraveled almost instantly. His attorney coached him to emphasize fear, instinct, and perceived threat. But the video stood in stark contradiction to every claim he made. He insisted Elijah's posture seemed aggressive. The gallery reacted with disbelief. He claimed Sophia appeared to reach for something. Judge Ellison reminded him that no such moment occurred in the footage. His voice grew tight as he repeated phrases that had once served him well during past reviews. Phrases like split-second decision, high-risk environment, and compliance failure. But in this courtroom, stripped of the old protections, his language sounded hollow. Each word exposed his inability to acknowledge wrongdoing, and with every attempt to justify his actions, the distance between the truth and his version of it grew wider. The most powerful moment came when Elijah himself walked slowly to the witness stand. He moved with a steadiness that carried both age and authority. The courtroom rose in respect before he spoke a single word. He took his oath, settled into the witness chair, and allowed a long silence to settle around him. That silence commanded more attention than any statement that had preceded it. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but unwavering. He described the funeral, the memory of Lawson lifting him from the burning Humvee in Helmand, and the promise he had made to salute his brother one last time. He spoke not of his torment, but of the dignity stolen from a moment meant for honor. "I have faced the Taliban without flinching," he said quietly, "but that day, I trembled because the man sworn to protect me pointed a gun at me for the color of my skin." His words broke something open in the room. Several soldiers wiped their eyes. Sophia bowed her head, tears falling silently. Even the court clerk had to steady herself before continuing. Riley's attorney attempted a sharp cross-examination, but nothing he said pierced Elijah's resolve. "Did you resist in any way?" he asked. Elijah answered, "No." "Did you threaten the officer?" Elijah replied, "No." "Did you reach into your pocket, adjust your jacket, or make any sudden movements?" Elijah paused, then answered with calm resignation, "I stood at a casket and saluted my brother." That line would be repeated across the country in broadcasts, newspapers, and social media for weeks afterward. By the time closing arguments ended, the outcome felt inevitable. The jury deliberated for only 5 hours before returning with a verdict that resounded through the courtroom, guilty on all counts, civil rights violations and assault under color of law. Riley's face collapsed as the words were read. His hands shook. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, But nothing softened the blow of accountability finally delivered. Judge Ellison sentenced him to 5 years in federal prison. He was terminated from the police department immediately, stripped of pension benefits, and decertified from law enforcement within days. His wife filed for divorce, his home went up for sale, and his former colleagues distanced themselves with quiet urgency. The career he had guarded so fiercely ended not with glory, but with a courtroom sentence and a nation's condemnation. The civil suit followed swiftly. Elijah prevailed, though the initial $75,000 award was later reduced to $45,000 on appeal. For him, the amount mattered far less than the principle. His dignity had been restored publicly, and the truth had been affirmed under oath. He accepted the verdict with the same calm that defined every step of his life. The reforms began quietly, almost cautiously, as if the institutions responsible sensed that the ground beneath them had shifted permanently and were trying to regain balance before the full weight of public expectation came crashing down. But once the first measures were announced, the momentum became unstoppable. The Windsor Police Department, long shielded by habit, hierarchy, and a culture that tolerated silence, found itself stripped bare by public scrutiny and forced to confront the decade of failings exposed during the trial. The police chief, flanked by city officials who now spoke in careful tones shaped by accountability, announced that every disciplinary file in the department would be made public. It was a move that sent shockwaves through the force. Officers whose records had been quietly buried for years felt the tremor of exposure approaching. Families of past complainants gathered in community halls, waiting to read the files that once disappeared into drawers. Transparency, once a distant idea, became an immediate reality. And with that transparency came judgment, not from courts alone, but from the community that had demanded answers for far too long. Mandatory bias training followed, but this time it was not the shallow, checkbox version departments across the country had used to satisfy grant requirements. The state mandated a 12-week, fully accredited program developed by veterans advocates, civil rights scholars, and retired military officers who understood how to dismantle the unexamined beliefs that shaped daily policing. Officers were required not only to attend, but to demonstrate comprehension through practical evaluations. Some resisted, some complained, some left the department altogether rather than engage in a process that challenged their long-held assumptions. But most remained, compelled by the new oversight structure, one that removed disciplinary authority from internal hands and shifted it to a civilian review board with real power, real subpoena authority, and the mandate to review all past misconduct cases within a 5-year period. The creation of that review board marked a cultural shift. Community leaders who had once been dismissed as activists or troublemakers now sat at the head of the table. Veterans who had served in Iraq, Afghanistan, Panama, and beyond now participated as advisors. Widow Sarah Lawson agreed to serve as one of the inaugural members, believing that her husband's burial would not be in vain if she could help safeguard future families from the indignities she had witnessed. The board held its first public meeting to a packed auditorium, where citizens watched as members read aloud summaries of past complaints, including the 12 filed against Riley. The sound of each summary carried the gravity of a delayed reckoning. Applause broke out at moments of truth. Silence followed moments of pain, and many who had once doubted the value of civilian oversight now saw its necessity with unmistakable clarity. But the transformation did not end within the police department. The viral footage had ignited a wider conversation across the state and, eventually, across the nation about disparities in veterans' benefits and burial rights. Questions so long ignored that even seasoned lawmakers were forced to admit they had overlooked the issue. The Regional Veterans Affairs Headquarters, under mounting pressure, agreed to reopen 180 previously denied claims involving post-traumatic stress disorder and burial honors, Elijah Thompson's file. once buried under bureaucratic indifference, became the catalyst for that audit. Advocates traveled from across the state to assist families who had struggled alone for years. For many, it was the first time anyone had taken their stories seriously. Some cried when they received letters acknowledging past errors. Others remained guarded but cautiously hopeful as new hearings were scheduled. Veterans Affairs officials released a public apology, delivered in a solemn press conference. The director stood with hands clasped, acknowledging that unacceptable disparities had affected Black veterans disproportionately. He did not attempt to soften the truth with euphemisms. He did not offer excuses. He stated plainly that a system meant to honor service had failed too many who had given everything. The apology, though overdue, struck a chord across the country. Veterans organizations responded with cautious optimism and renewed commitment to oversight. Legislators proposed bills that would require independent review of all racially skewed benefit denials. Committees formed with remarkable speed, driven by a recognition that the issue had reached a national audience and demanded more than temporary fixes. Through all of this, Elijah remained a quiet presence. He never appeared at rallies. He never delivered speeches. He never sought involvement in the political rush surrounding his name. Instead, he spent long days sorting through paperwork with Sophia, responding to messages from veterans who thanked him for giving voice to pain they had carried alone. Some messages came from men who had served under him decades earlier. Others came from strangers who had seen the video and recognized their own experiences in the tears he fought through that day. Elijah answered each note with the same humility. "I am grateful you shared your story." He wrote, "Keep speaking. Your truth matters." When the civil settlement arrived, reduced on appeal but still substantial, Elijah did not hesitate. He quietly donated most of the $45,000 to a foundation supporting Black veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder. Sophia watched him sign the final documents, her eyes filling with pride. He explained simply, "Some men never had the chance to heal. If this helps even one soldier find peace, it is worth more than any dollar amount." The foundation soon expanded its reach, offering counseling, legal assistance, and resources for families navigating the difficult terrain of trauma. Veterans who attended those programs often asked to meet Elijah. He declined every request, not because he lacked compassion, but because he believed the work mattered more than the man. Across Virginia, police training academies adopted new curriculum inspired by the case. Young recruits now studied the footage in ethics modules, learning how bias, unchecked authority, and poor judgment could destroy lives and careers. Instructors emphasized the line Elijah spoke at the funeral, "I came to salute my brother," as an example of dignity meeting injustice. That line became part of statewide training material, repeated in classrooms where future officers were taught to see not just uniforms, but humanity. News outlets continued to follow the unfolding reforms, documenting the ripple effects with measured reverence. Analysts noted that the case had reshaped not only one department, but the broader professional culture surrounding policing and military respect. Ordinary citizens felt the change as well. Funeral directors reported more consistent cooperation with local officers. Veterans' families spoke of improved treatment at cemeteries, and communities that once felt ignored now felt a measure of agency restored. At home, Elijah watched these changes unfold with a calm that reflected both hope and sorrow. The transformation was necessary, but it came at a cost. The humiliation suffered at a friend's funeral, the pain carried through a nation's screens, the long nights where sleep returned slowly, yet he believed, with the quiet conviction that had shaped every step of his life, that no sacrifice was wasted if it led to justice for others. Elijah Marcus Thompson returned to the Virginia State Military Cemetery on a quiet morning when the world felt still enough to let memory rise without interruption. He arrived alone this time, without cameras, without reporters, without the crush of public voices that had followed him since the day Officer Thomas Riley turned a funeral into a national reckoning. The sky was pale, touched with the soft light of early dawn, and the rows of markers stretched out before him with the solemn order that only military ground could hold. He walked with a measured pace, each step guided by a mixture of reverence and the ache that comes from carrying grief across too many years. His dress hat rested in his hand, not out of ceremony, but out of respect for the man who had once pulled him from a burning Humvee and whispered, "You hold the line, Eli, always." When he reached Colonel David Lawson's grave, he stood in silence for a long moment, allowing the weight of memory to settle with the dignity it deserved. No sound broke the air. No one watched. And for the first time since that terrible day, Elijah felt the space to honor his friend without fear, without humiliation, and without the shadow of injustice pressing against his breath. He lowered himself onto the stone bench beside the grave, placed the hat across his knee, and let the quiet speak to him the way battlefields sometimes spoke long after the war ended. As he sat there, the world around him faded into something gentle, something human. He thought of Lawson not as a soldier, but as the young man who had laughed with him in tents lit by a single lantern, who had shared letters from home, who had stood with him through nights filled with fire and mornings filled with dust. He remembered the weight of Lawson's hand gripping his shoulder during moments when neither of them knew whether dawn would come. And he remembered the promise he made on the morning of the funeral, to salute his brother with every measure of respect a soldier could offer. That promise had turned into something he had not expected. Instead of one final tribute, he had found himself at the center of a story that forced a nation to confront truths it had long ignored. But here, in this quiet place, Elijah allowed himself to grieve not the trial, not the reforms, not the outrage, but simply the loss of a friend. He traced the name etched into the stone with a slow, deliberate hand. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice soft and steady, "for saving me then, and for guiding me now." Footsteps approached faintly along the gravel path, small and hesitant. Elijah lifted his head and saw a young black boy walking beside his mother, perhaps no more than 7 or 8 years old. The boy noticed the 2 stars on Elijah's shoulder boards and slowed. His mother whispered something to him, a gentle reminder to give space. But the boy's eyes widened with recognition, not of rank, but of presence. Something in the general's quiet posture struck him. Something in the dignity he carried made the child stop, without being told, without any prompting at all. The boy straightened, placed his small feet together, lifted his chin, and delivered a crisp, earnest salute. It was imperfect in form, but perfect in meaning. Elijah felt his breath catch in his chest, not from pain, but from the deep, quiet gratitude that rises when one generation honors another without understanding the full weight of the moment. He rose slowly from the bench, meeting the boy's gaze with a gentle steadiness. He returned the salute with the precision of a lifetime of service. But when the boy lowered his hand, Elijah placed a warm, steady palm on the child's shoulder. "You never have to salute me, son," he said, his voice carrying the softness of a man reclaiming something lost. "Just remember this. Never lower your head when you know you're right." The boy nodded with a seriousness far beyond his years. His mother placed her hand gently on his back, gratitude shining in her expression. She whispered, "Thank you, sir." And Elijah answered only with a quiet nod before watching them continue down the path. When they were gone, he turned back to Lawson's grave and felt something shift inside him. Not closure, but clarity. The country had changed because of what happened here. Policies were rewritten. Oversight boards now held real authority. The Veterans Affairs reopened claims long ignored. Officers trained with new purpose, and families who once felt invisible now felt seen. None of that erased the pain. None of it restored the dignity taken from a sacred ceremony. But it ensured that the moment of violence, captured on a phone held by a trembling granddaughter, would not be buried with the others lost to silence. Elijah did not take pride in the reforms. He did not claim credit for the cultural shift. He simply acknowledged that the truth, once exposed, became a force that moved through the state, through the nation, and through the lives of those who had suffered in quiet. He sat for another hour, reflecting on the road behind him and the uncertain one ahead. The trial had ended. The reforms had begun. But healing was a slower process, measured not by headlines, but by the steady return of breath, by the softening of old fears, by the way sunlight fell gently across a name carved in stone. Elijah bowed his head one final time, a gesture not of defeat, but of gratitude. Then he rose, placed his hat beneath his arm, and took one last look at the grave of the man who had saved him twice, once in Helmand and once in death, as he walked away. The cemetery remained quiet, yet the echoes of everything that had changed lingered in the air. No cameras, no reporters, no crowd demanding justice, just one old soldier, walking with steady steps, knowing that while the world had watched the violence, it was now living the consequences. His story had become a lesson, a mirror, and a call to conscience. And though he never sought fame or recognition, his dignity had spoken louder than any speech, louder than any protest, louder than any fury. It had become a guidepost for the reforms that followed, and a reminder that even the most powerful truths can begin with a single, silent salute. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please subscribe, leave a like, and share it with someone who believes in justice.